Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition, another episode of Off the Hook with Matty D. We are just before Veterans Day, and it's a time for us to honor and remember those veterans who continue to serve our great nation and who have served our great nation and in the different armed services. And one of the ways that we're going to do that here on Off the Hook with Matty D is to talk about a program that involves veterans and fly fishing, and that is, of course, Project Healing Waters. Now, you might remember back in August, I had on Tony Escalona, who is the local chapter president for Project Healing Waters, and he has about 40 different veterans who come to his monthly meetings, and they tie flies, and they do fishing, and it really is a great outreach for those veterans looking to get back in to life, because sometimes it's tough to do that. Well, I have another big treat today, and I'm really excited about this. I have a gentleman here by the name of Beau Beasley who just wrote this book called Healing Waters, Veteran Stories of Recovery in Their Own Words. And Beau joins me now. And Beau, first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Matt. I'm really excited about being here.
This is your third book. You have written a couple of books before about fly fishing in Virginia, fly fishing in the Mid-Atlantic. That certainly touches your heart. You love fly fishing, but this one goes even deeper. This took a lot of work for you.
Yeah, it did. Interestingly enough, I ended up doing fly fishing kind of therapy for myself. I'm a retired Fairfax County firefighter. I spent 30 years with Fairfax County, and one day I was on a mobile intensive care unit and ran a call with a gentleman that got stung by a bee. He was having some heart arrhythmias. We took him into the hospital, and on the way in, he revealed to me that he was a fly angler, and I said, "Wow, I've always wanted to learn how to fly fish, but like everybody else, I didn't know where to go." And this gentleman took me under his wing and taught me how to fly fish, and it really helped me because, as a paramedic and a firefighter, you see a lot of bad stuff. It's not like watching Rescue 911 where everything is a happy story at the end of the day. And fly fishing for me became a way for me to deal with the things that I was dealing with at work. And it was a great release. I'd been a conventional angler all my life prior to that. And people ask me, one of the most common questions I get is, well, is fly fishing any better than conventional fishing? And I tell people, no, that's not true. Fly fishing is not any better. It's just different. And I explain to people that fly fishing is traditional fishing what archery is to traditional hunting. It's not any different. It's just a different style. And I really connected with it, and I really liked it, and I've been doing it for more than 25 years now, and I really like it.
It's very therapeutic to be out on the water, to kind of just get surrounded by the environment, to forget about those day-to-day things. And like you said, being a retired firefighter, I remember reading in your book, which is an excellent book, by the way. Really
Thank you.
Enjoyed
Thank you very
it. One of your first calls, you were young on the job, and you appeared at the scene of what was, I believe, a fatal accident.
Yes.
And even, I think it was your captain said to me, "Are you okay? Because this is the type of stuff that you're going to see." And it was kind of your first time really seeing that sort of grim outlay, and that really stuck with you.
Yeah, it was my commanding officer at the time was Lieutenant Art Varnu, who was my prototype officer for the rest of my career. I stacked everybody else up against Art Varnu. Right. And we ran a call. I can close my eyes right now, and I can see the scene right now. And I was in for 30 years, and I've been retired for 10 years. So I can hit that 40-year rewind, and I can close my eyes and see the incident right now. And it was a vehicle that had struck a tree and burst into flames, which was really unusual. The car turned over on its hood, and the gas ran down onto the engine and caught the vehicle on fire, and the person inside was celebrating their 21st birthday. And he'd been driving drunk and hit a tree, and we put the car out. Obviously, we could not save him, and his girlfriend was in the vehicle behind him, so she was on the scene screaming for him to get out of the car. And I remember once the fire was out, I was just kind of numb because it's about 2:30 in the morning, and I'd never seen anything like that before. And Lieutenant Varnu came up beside me, and he said, "Do you smell that?" And he was referring to the burned body, right? And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "Son, that's what death smells like. You're going to see a lot of it on this job." And that, some people might say, oh, that was really harsh. Well, I think it was his way of reaching out to me and letting me know that this is what happens sometimes, and our job is to do the best we can with what we have. And his way of reaching out to me and being strong and in control, because I never saw this guy get nothing phased. I don't care what we went to. He was never phased. And as an officer, you try to project that yourself on an emergency scene. People, when you show up, they want the fire department to take charge. As one of my friends said, when they dial 911, they've already admitted they can't handle what's in front of them, and they need help. So that was kind of my baptism by fire, and I ran thousands and thousands and thousands of other calls after that. But yes, that was my very first one. And Lieutenant Varnu was a Purple Heart recipient. He was a wounded Marine. He fought in Vietnam. And the person who trained me, George Shepard, was a side gunner in a helicopter in Vietnam. So in that era, I was hired in the mid-'80s. There were a lot of Vietnam veterans in the fire department and in the police department.
And it was kind of a natural progression because they were in that brotherhood of Army, Marines, Navy, and there's that brotherhood in the firefighting or the police world as well. So that kind of felt natural to him. But even when you were in the fire department working with the different people who've come from Vietnam, they never talked about, because they just don't, what they witnessed, what they saw. And for you to be able to open up with some of the hundreds of people that you interviewed for this book, and we're going to talk about that in a second, I mean, that is a feat in itself, because a lot of veterans just don't want to talk about it because it brings back too many bad memories.
Yeah, I can tell you that in the years that I served for Lieutenant Varnu, and he would go on to become a captain, and I would see him on different scenes, he almost never talked about what he saw when he was in combat. And he gave me the most poignant quote about Vietnam I've ever heard in my life. He said, "Beau, we didn't lose the war in Vietnam. We weren't allowed to win." And I never forgot that. Now, when he came back, like many other Vietnam veterans, the media had so demonized the American soldier that they were traumatized when they came back, and they were under orders when they landed to the first civilian airport they got to in the States was to go immediately to the bathroom and change out of clothes and get into civilian clothes, because the media had made it out that the servicemen were just horrible people doing horrible things. And like most things, people only hear bits and pieces, and people tend to gravitate to what is the most sensational. And they came back from being overseas, and a lot of them, people don't really think about this. When we bring back a unit now, we try to bring back the whole unit at one time. In Vietnam, they sent them back one at a time. So one day you're out on the front lines, and then 3 days later you're back in Omaha. And you just, how do you go from a week ago, less than a week ago, people were shooting at me, and now I'm at the grocery store, and people say, "Hey, where you been?" And you have to explain to them, you've been overseas for a year. So when these Vietnam veterans came back, they had nobody really to talk to. And the veterans that I interviewed for this book, as diverse as they all have similar stories in that they come back and they're got a lot of stuff to deal with and don't exactly know how to deal with it.
So let's talk about this book, because first of all, it's a fantastic read, as I said. Project Healing Waters. It's the national organization. There are local chapters, and you first got introduced to the chapter up in Fort Belvoir, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the first time, ironically, I'm ashamed to say this, but the first time I heard of it, I was in a Trout Unlimited meeting in Warrenton. And a soldier was there, John Coburn, who I mentioned in the book, and he said, "Hey, there's this new nonprofit, and it's going to help veterans through fly fishing." And my first thought was, this will never work, because it's such a great idea that it's just isn't going to work. And he explained that Ed Nicholson, who was a retired Navy captain, had a little skin tag, cancerous tag taken off the top of his head. at Bethesda Naval Hospital and Walter Reed. And while he was recovering, he noticed there were dozens and dozens and dozens of other people in the recovery ward with him, all coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were horribly injured. Some missing limbs, some with traumatic brain injuries. And he thought, I'd like to take one of these guys out fly fishing and just get them out of the hospital for a little while. And one person turned into 2, turned into 5, turned into 10. And now almost, next year, it'll be 20 years later,
right.
There are hundreds of programs all over the country, and it's open to any veteran of any service, of any rank, at any time that wants to come and be a part of Project Healing Waters. And the concept is very simple. We take veterans, when I say we, I'm talking the royal we, not me as an individual.
Sure.
We take veterans out and teach them how to fly fish and how to tie flies, and they get to meet other veterans and spend time with them. And I can tell you, as a firefighter and a paramedic, if I saw a really bad call, if I went to a double shooting or I went to a traumatic car incident, I remember being in a car one time where there were 4 people in the car and I was the only one that was alive. And I'm just going from one person to the next, and it's just, it gets to you.
For
and
sure.
when you get out, when it's first over with, you don't think that much about it. You're kind of numb. And then when you realize, hey, this is really bothering me, you start having nightmares, you can't concentrate, and you have a hard time connecting with other people, what you want to do, you want to talk to another fireman. Mm-hmm. You want to talk to another paramedic and say, well, Maddie, if you were there, what would you have done? Mm-hmm. Right? And it's the same thing with these veterans. I don't care if you're a cop or a fireman or a paramedic or, quite frankly, a social worker. Nobody says, I really want to go see a psychiatrist.
Right.
I really want to get in touch with my feelings and dig up all this bad stuff. No, nobody wants to do that,
right.
Or at least I didn't.
Right.
And I have suffered from my own issues, but it got so bad I had to go see somebody. And it's the same thing here. We put them around other soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that have been in similar situations, and they just hang out. And my friend Alan Folger, who had illustrated my book, Fly Fishing the Mid-Atlantic, called me. First I did Fly Fishing Virginia, and it did well, so my publisher said, hey, you need to do another one. So I did Fly Fishing the Mid-Atlantic. And when that book came out, Alan Folger, the artist who'd illustrated my book, called me and said, hey, I've got an idea for your next book. And I'm like, look, Alan, I just finished my second book. The last thing I want to think about is
start
doing
another one.
Another book. And I said, but okay, I'll bite. Mm-hmm. What should I do it on? He said, you ought to write about Project Healing Waters. And I said, absolutely not. That is not going to happen.
And why was that? Because you didn't feel like you were qualified?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. First of all, I wasn't a veteran. Mm-hmm. And number 2, how am I going to relate to these guys? And number 3, not to sound too self-effacing, I do guidebooks. It's pretty simple. Here's the river. Here's where you park. Here's the kind of fish you're going to catch. This kind of gear you need. Here's 3 flies I recommend and a couple of guides. And then you go to the next one. And I joke with people, it's the Harlequin romance novel, right? It's just the names of the rivers and the guides and the fly shops change, but the theme is the same. Well, when Alan told me about this, I had met many of these men and women, and I'd already been a volunteer for multiple years, and I'm like, dude, there's no way I'm taking this on. I'm not capable of doing this. I couldn't. I've never been trained. There's no way this is going to happen. And he kept after me for almost 2 years.
Yep.
And then finally, I was at Fire Station 27, my last assignment, and ironically, where I was serving as a captain back in the same station where Lieutenant Varnu trained me. So it was nice to go there as a rookie and then leave as the commanding officer for one of the shifts.
Sure.
From the station I started as a rookie. And he said, Beau, you have to write this book because this guy was practically a prophet. He said, sooner or later, they're going to quit fighting in Afghanistan, and they're going to quit fighting in Iraq, and they're going to forget all about these people. And you can't let that happen. And I was like, oh, wow.
He got the heartstring there.
He did. He did. If he had punched me in the face, he wouldn't have gotten my attention any better. And I said, okay, well, Alan, I'll try. I went back, I talked to my wife about it, much to my surprise. She said, "Oh, I think it's a great idea." And she edits everything I write, so I had to have her buy in. And I thought, well, and I did not want to do the book. I was adamant that I didn't want to do it. And I thought, well, my publisher is not going to go for this because he's going to have to put up 35 or 40 grand
Right.
without any hope that this thing is going to sell, because a lot of fly shops may not care. It's not going to help them sell gear. It's not going to help them sell trips.
Right.
It's more a human interest story, and that's not what I do. Well, I called him up. He was a volunteer at Fort Huachuca in Arizona already. He's like, "Oh, no, I'm in." So I was like, well, okay,
So you're
Lord.
getting squeezed from all
Yeah,
sides.
I'm like, okay, well, everybody around me is saying they're going to help me do this. And I started writing it. I interviewed a few. Now, keep in mind, I knew as much as you did about how to do it. I don't have a clue.
Right.
And I spent about 2 years off and on. I'd interview, I'd find people. I had a questionnaire that I would send out, which was 100% the wrong way to do it. And I gathered some information, and I wrote 2 or 3 narratives. And I gave it to my wife, who edits everything I write.
Yep.
And a couple of days go by, and I didn't hear anything from her. And I'm like, "Hey, what'd you think of what I sent you?" And she said, "Well, it's okay," which means it sucks. Means it's terrible. And I said, "Layla, what's wrong?" And she said, "Honey, I know you, and I know how you write, and I know how you feel about veterans, and it's just not coming through. You're just kind of like at 10,000 feet, and you really need to spend time with these men and women and get to know them, really know them." And I said, "Well, how do you suggest I do that?" And she said, "Well, aren't there programs nearby?" I said, "Yeah, there's one in Fort Belvoir, headed up at the time by Bob Gardner, who's a program lead, and another one in Quantico, headed up by Marty Laxberg." And it was at the time, and it still might be, the only Project Healing Waters program held on a Marine Corps base. And I went to them with my idea, and I said, "Hey, this is what I want to do." And they said, "Great, as long as you understand there's only one rule." And Marty Laxberger, retired first sergeant, said, "As long as you understand that the veterans come first, and you can shadow us and you can be around us all you want, but if you get between us and the veterans, or you get between the veteran getting better and your book, it's not going to go well for you." And he was
straight up. Yeah.
He was a multiple tour combat Marine. He didn't have any tolerance for his men and women not being put first. So I started shadowing them, and things progressed. And one day I got a call from Ed Nicholson, who's the founder of the organization. He knew I was working on the book, and he said, "Hey, I want you to come on a trip."
This is the one out to Idaho.
Yes, Middle Fork of the Salmon River. And so I flew out, and there were about 14 of us there, and I was about the only non-military guy. All of the rest of them were soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. And I was teamed up. We spent one night in a hotel, and then we went out onto the river and floated down the river for 5 or 6 days and stayed in a tents. My roommate was a staff sergeant named Brian Mancini, who was a combat medic. And Brian had been traumatically injured. He had a traumatic brain injury, lost his eye, and had been, took him over a year to get out of the hospital. Now, I don't know about you, but I have the flu for about 3 days at home, and I'm ready to lose my mind, right? Well, I'm dealing with people that are in the hospital for a year at a time, and that's not abnormal, right? I know guys that spent more than a year, and you can't wrap your head around that. Well, Brian had been a medic. I was a medic, so what did we do? And at the time, I was still working full-time for the fire department. We talked medic stuff. And he said, "Yeah, one time I saw this." And I said, "Well, one time I saw that." And he said, "Well, one time I had to do that." So we're going back and forth.
But you're creating that bond.
Yes.
Yeah.
And although I wasn't in the military, we were both, well, I wouldn't say we're both combat medics. I would never put myself on that level because nobody ever tried to hurt me when I'm at work.
Sure.
But I could relate to having to make decisions that you think might make the difference between somebody surviving and not.
Right.
And as the night went on, it became readily apparent to me that what I had seen was nothing that could pale in comparison to what Brian Mancini had seen. And, he's working on friends. He's working on people that he knew. And I was working on complete strangers. So there was the emotional disconnect was tremendous in difference. And then it got to a point in the night where I could tell in his mind he was going someplace that I couldn't go. And he said to me, Beau, I've lost my wife, I've lost my health, and I've lost my career in the service of my country. What else do I have to give up? And I didn't know what to say. I was just dumbfounded. And I realized at that moment just an enormous disconnect between those who fight for us and those who stay home. And for us, it's like 3 or 4 minutes on the nightly news. Right? Or we watch MASH reruns and think that's what it's like.
It's not even.
And it's not even remotely close.
Right.
And it really got to me how traumatized Brian had been and how he'd lost his eye and how he'd been in the hospital for over a year and his wife left him. And he would be the first to admit that he does not blame his wife. Right? Because they come back and they're literally, sometimes literally a different person.
Yeah.
Right? And the person that they married is not the person that comes back.
Right.
That's very common. And he and I spent a week together on the river, and we got pretty close. And I had been working on the book for a number of years. And I got a call one day, and Brian had done real well. He moved out to Arizona. He'd started his own nonprofit. I actually saw him on the Oprah Winfrey Show, a little clip with him and his service dog. And then I got a call one day that Brian had killed himself. And the book is dedicated to Brian Mancini and all the men and women in the service who don't make it back or who come back and then have to continue to struggle on a different battlefield. And the very first copy of this book was sent to his father. So the first book I sent to his father with a personal letter. And the book is, there are 32 narratives of 32 real people. And you will get to see their pictures and where they're from. The thing I'm probably the proudest of in this book is that there are no composite characters. And I tell people this book isn't based on true stories. It is true stories. As best these men and women can relate to me. And it was very hard. And people say, oh my gosh, well, how long did it take you to do this book? And from the date of conception to printing was almost 9 years.
Wow.
And I probably spent 5,000 hours minimum writing this book. And people are like, gee, Beau, why did it take so long? Well, first of all, remember, I didn't know what I was doing. That's number one.
Right.
Number two, I found these people and I wrote about them because the process is I'd find a veteran that I could connect with.
Sure.
Then I found, and I would say to them, and every one of them was the same way. There were no variances. I'd say, hey, Maddie, you know me. I'd like to write about your experience. You know I'm writing this book. I'd like to interview you.
Yep.
No, absolutely not. Well, Maddie, look, just let me interview you. I'm going to tell your story your way. This is not going to be my interpretation. Let me interview you. Then I'll write the narrative, and you'll have 100% control over what's put in print.
And did that make it easier for them to say yes to you, or is it still a kind of a little bit of
I
tug
think
of
all
war?
that did was let me get in the door.
Okay.
Because then I had to prove it. So here's how it would go. I would find a veteran, and I would feel comfortable enough to approach them about being in the book. And then I'd interview them, usually over my phone or with a tape recorder. Because originally I tried to make notes while I was talking to them, and that became too distracting.
Right.
So I would interview them. Okay, tell me about your experience. Why did you go in the military? And like with every interview, you start out with something simple. What's your name? What's your rank?
Sure.
What branch? Why did you go in? What was your MOS? That kind of thing. And then you would get into them and their background and why they wanted to join. And so sometimes that interview would be 2 hours of audio. I would take that tape, send it to a transcriptionist. The transcriptionist would transcribe it, send me back the text. Then I would formulate a narrative based on the interview. Then I would send it back to the veteran and say, this is the narrative that I wrote about you based on the information that you gave me. Is this correct? And sometimes they would say, almost never was it, it's perfect, leave it the way it is.
Right.
They would say, well, you know, you got me at this fort at this time, but that's not the right timeline. Or, you know, Beau, I appreciate the promotion, but you've got me at a rank that I didn't attain. Or worst case scenario, I got you in the wrong service, right? And you don't want to tell a Marine that really he was in the Navy. That they tend not to really like that a whole lot. So so then they would look at the narrative. Then I would get it back with their corrections. Or they would say, like I had one veteran say, hey, this is exactly right, but Beau, my mama is not going to understand about me wanting to kill myself. She's just not going to understand, so we have to take all that out. So then I would have to rewrite the narrative, send it back to them a second time. They would review it a second time, then send it back to me. Then it would get proofread by my publisher. We'd send it back a third time with the photographs. So I had to get photographs from all of them, then write all the captions. Then they would approve it a third time. Then it would go to Blue Line with my editor for the finals. Well, I did that process about 40 times.
Right. That's a lot of, it's a lot
and
of
then
back and forth.
out of the 40, only 32 went to print because I had more than one that in the end said, I just can't do it. I just can't. I'm not ready. I had one or two of them say, look, I've talked to this about this whole process to my therapist, and right now my therapist doesn't think I'm ready.
And that's, you have to respect that 100%,
Absolutely,
of course.
absolutely,
Yes. Yeah.
because it's their story. It's not my story. It's their story, and I wanted to do it. That's why it's Healing Waters, veteran stories of recovery in their own words, and as much as I could possibly do it, that's what I did. I had that in their own words. So some of this is pretty brash. It is not an easy read. You're not gonna sit down and read this cover to cover as a general rule. Now, I've only found one person that did that, and the next day they read the entire book again.
Wow.
And the next day they contacted me and said, I want to buy them by the case because I have friends I want to send these to. So, but that's rare. That's the only person I've met like that.
You mentioned a couple of things, Beau. First of all, we should mention the suicide rate among military veterans is 18 per day, which is an astronomical rate. So anything we can do to help veterans is number one. And I think you are doing that by allowing them to tell their story because it is giving them that therapy. And you might have only brought 40 to Blue Line, 32 that are in the book, but there might be dozens that have that similar story, that make that connection, that hopefully are able to then join Project Healing Waters, talk with the local veteran, somebody that they can confide in and maybe start to come out of the shell. Because as you said, they come back and they are not the same person that they once were. I mean, it is very, very tough for sure.
Well, you know, none of us are. We all go through our own individual experiences and things change us. But I think, you know, I had three objectives when I wrote this. The first objective was to honor Brian Mancini and the other men and women like him. The second was to raise money for Project Healing Waters, and a portion of every book, no matter where it is sold, goes back to headquarters. They don't have to do anything for it. Every quarter, we find out how many books were sold, and then they get a percentage of wholesale sent to headquarters. And then the third reason was so the public could understand what it cost these men and women to serve, because we don't have a clue.
Right.
And then I guess the fourth would be, in the honoring the men and women, they read it and they go, hey, that's me. Or they read it. I was at a book signing once, and the veteran, it was a 2-day event. It was at the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival. He bought a book, and then the next day he came back to the author's booth, and I'm like, dude, you were here yesterday. He said, yep, you're right. The book yesterday was for me. The book today is for my therapist. She needs to read this. And I have found now I have psychiatrists or psychologists that are buying them by the case and giving them to their clients. Last week, something happened that I would have never in a million years would I have guessed this. But Fly Fisherman Magazine ran an excerpt of my book. Somehow that found its way into a prison, and a social worker who works with veterans in a correctional institute came across it. One of the veterans came to her and said, hey, I think we need to get this. And last weekend I sent a case of books to a Michigan penitentiary because they have a unit there that deals with incarcerated veterans that are dealing with PTSD. So it's not a special prison just for veterans, right? It's a
just
prison that has veterans there that are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever terminology. And this is nothing new. You know, the Greeks used to write about this. The Romans used to. So this is not like something we discovered after the Vietnam War, right? I mean, there were plenty of people who were traumatized during the Civil War, right? Anytime
you see mass carnage or your friends or
there's no way you cannot be affected by it. So it just allowed them to realize, hey, I'm not abnormal. I'm having a normal response to an abnormal situation, and I'm not alone. That's the most important thing. If you ask me, Beau, why in the world would you come back from a war zone and you got a wife and 2 kids and you're going back to work for whatever, and they shoot themselves? Well, what's up with that?
Because they can't adapt. It's impossible. The demons are there.
And they feel disconnected. Yeah. And what Project Healing Waters does, and other organizations like Warriors in Quiet Waters, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers has a military initiative. There are a lot of nonprofit groups, Bold Face Fly Fishing out in Colorado, that's trying to help veterans. It helps connect them to their own community, right? When I left the fire department, my last day at work, I was relieved at 6:30 in the evening, and the people on my shift got a call at 3 minutes at 6:33, and I watched my crew, the engine and the medic unit, go out without me, and I cried like a little boy.
Because that's all you knew. That's your life.
I was never going to do it again. Right? Nobody was ever going to say, well, Captain Beasley, what do you want to do now? Right? These men and women get injured or for whatever reason get separated, and they're not Captain Jackson anymore. They're not Lieutenant Burkhart, who is assigned to a group of Marines. They're not Lieutenant Commander Jones, or they're not Specialist whatever, or Coast Guardsman whatever, assigned to a small unit with that unit cohesion, and that all goes away. So they come back, they don't have their job, they don't have their rank, they're not tied. They need a new unit and a new mission and a new person. I can tell you right now, I bet everything I own, if you put 3 firefighters in this room with us right now, the first thing they're going to say is, well, you're assigned to an engine? Are you assigned to a truck? No, I was on a heavy-duty rescue squad. All right, well, I don't talk to you guys, right? So they're just, right, because we used to joke that the rescue squad guys, the guys on the heavy, guys and women, on the heavy-duty rescue truck, all they do is search, right? They don't touch hoses. They don't throw ladders. They search. That's all they do. So the rivalry among the rescue people was, look, we're the rescue. We don't even know why the rescue guys are here. Because if you were any good, you wouldn't be on that hook and ladder truck, right? And, the engine guys would tell the hook and ladder truck, there's only 2 things that put out fire, water and courage, and neither one of them are on that hook and ladder truck, right? So it's the same thing with the military. There's a cohesiveness and a bond there, a military camaraderie born of adversity that cannot be created anywhere else. And when that's gone, there's a sense of being disconnected, unmoored, like a sail that's not tethered and it's just flapping in the wind. And what that leads to often is isolation. And I can tell you from my own experience in the fire department, we've struggled with people that, I really don't want to go see anybody, So I think what I'll do is I think I'll apply some bourbon to it and see how that comes out.
Right.
And it usually not a good
Not
outcome
outcome,
with that. So Project Healing Waters, whether it's in Richmond or Bristol, Tennessee, or my friends out in Michigan or in California or in Colorado Springs, Colorado, or the Marine base in Quantico, or especially my friends in Fort Belvoir, it gives them an opportunity to get together and be around other people that know what they've been through and how they can reconnect and be part of the community.
So you mentioned something while we're talking here, and we're going to talk with you in the future. You're also part of Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival.
Correct.
You run that. And at that, you met a veteran. His name was Jerry. And this story really stuck with me. You got him hooked up with Project Healing Waters. He started to come out of his shell. He started to fish. He started to really enjoy it. And then one day, you hadn't heard from him in a long time. And his wife called you.
Yes.
And said, Beau, do you remember Jerry? And you said, yeah. And how is he? How are things? And she goes, and that's why I'm calling you, because unfortunately he passed away and we're holding a service for him. And the comment that stuck to me, and I think this speaks volumes about your heart, and even in writing this book, is you got him involved with Project Healing Waters, and she found her husband again because of how much he enjoyed the camaraderie, the brothership, the fly fishing. It all came together, and she found the man that was not from the military was the person that she married. I think that's amazing.
Well, and I have to give credit where credit's due here. The credit initially needs to go to the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. They have a magazine, and I had written for that Virginia Wildlife publication, and he had read, I think they ran an excerpt of my book, Fly Fishing Virginia.
Right.
And he called me on the phone, and he said, hey, he got in touch with me some way through the game department. Hey, I really liked your book, and it was I really enjoyed it. Just want to say thanks for writing this, and I'm saving up for it, and he told me he'd been in the Army, and that rung a bell, and I thought, oh, where are you, and where do you live, and what's your address? And I sent him, and he said he wanted to come to the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival. Well, I mailed him a copy of my book, Fly Fishing Virginia, and I put a pair of tickets in there to the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival. And this is when it was held in Waynesboro. This is probably 10 or 12 years ago. And he calls me up 3 days before the event. And you can imagine running the entire event.
You're so busy.
I'm fried. And he said, hey, this is Jerry. I'm so upset, I don't know what to do. I said, well, what's wrong, Jerry? And Jerry was a diabetic. He'd served in the Army, I think, for 3 years, and he had one of his feet removed, which is not uncommon for severe diabetics. Right. And he said, Beau, I'm so upset. It's supposed to rain. I don't know how I'm going to get down to the river. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I said, well, Jerry, you show up. I'll take care of everything else. Mm-hmm. Well, sure enough, 2 weeks later, it's raining cats and dogs. It's terrible. And it's raining as hard as it can rain. And at this point, the festival was outside in a series of tents. Now, I've been working on this for 9 months,
right,
and then it rains.
It's the last thing you want.
And I mean, it was like somebody canceled Christmas, right? I'm miserable. And you can hear how hard the rain's raining because you can hear it on the top of the tent. And one of my guys who volunteered said, hey, Beau, you need to come see this. I'm like, no, I'm in the middle of it. He said, no, you really need to see this. I walk outside, and Alex Kalana, who was a retired gunnery sergeant from the Marine Corps, was out with Jerry in the rain. And somebody had given him an Orvis poncho, and he's out there casting, and it looked pretty terrible because he'd never done it before.
Right, sure.
But Alex kept working with him. Working with him.
In the pouring buckets.
In the pouring down rain. And eventually, he got really good because he needs what everybody needs. He needs some instruction. You can watch YouTube all you want.
You're never going to learn.
It's not going to happen.
Right.
You need somebody to teach you, to say, well, you can't see yourself. What you're doing is you're breaking your wrist here, or you're bringing your arm back too far there, or whatever, right? So he learned how to cast. He had a great time. He and his wife had a great time. Jerry called me about a month later and said, "Hey, guess what and he was being seen at McGuire Hospital here in Richmond. Yep. Guess what I did last week?" I said, "I don't know, Jerry. I went out and I caught my first bass on a popping bug." And then he called me back later. "Yeah, I caught one on a fly that I tied." And he was so excited. And then I didn't hear from him for a while. You know, life goes on. And
of course.
About 8 months later, I'd been at the fire station, I'd been on duty. It was a rough night. I came home. We work 24-hour shifts. Technically, according to the letter of the law, we work from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. the next day, but most firefighters come to work at 6:15 because after our brother or sister has been at work for 23 hours, we don't want them to have to go out again at the last minute.
Right.
So I'd probably gotten at work about 6 a.m. We'd been up most of the night. I came home. I'm exhausted. I'm still in uniform. I laid down on the bed with my wife. We were going to try to go to church the next morning. And the phone rang at 7:30 in the morning. And I'm like, who's calling me at 7:30 in the morning or 8:30? And it was a woman. And she said, "Is this Beau Beasley?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." And she goes, "Well, I've really been thinking about you." And I'm like, okay, well, now I'm in bed with my wife listening to this other woman tell me she's been, I'm like, ah. And she said, "Hey, and she told me your name. I'm Jerry's wife." "Oh, yeah, I remember. How are you doing?" She said, "Well, I wanted to call you because today we're having Jerry's funeral." And it really choked me up. And she said, "I want you to know how much it meant to us to come to the festival, to have that time together." And Jerry loved being with those guys in Project Healing Waters. And she said it was like somebody, charging up a battery. I cannot put into words to you how much it meant for what Project Healing Waters did for him. And I wanted to call you, and I thought, man, how much does it have to have an impact on you to call the day of the funeral?
Right.
You're thinking about me on the day of the funeral. And that's just one of 31 other narratives that aren't maybe quite as powerful as that, but that gives you a sense of what the book it was like and how hard it was for me to write it. I've never written anything. I had somebody ask me one time, "Beau," and it was another writer, "when did you know you were getting really good material?" I said, "That's easy. When I started having nightmares." And I wasn't the one that was there. They're just telling me the story, and I'm feeling it by proxy, right? And when you're writing, and while you're writing, you're crying so hard you can't see the monitor. You've got some very powerful stuff, but it was very intimidating for me because I cannot stress how I did not know what I was doing.
Right. So you were warned by Lefty Kreh, person you met, a former Marine, if I'm not mistaken. He said it would be very difficult for you to write this book, and he pulled no punches. He said it in a lot of probably interesting language.
Yes, Lefty Kreh, any fly angler pretty much knows who he is. He's the most famous fly fisherman in the world. He actually served in the Army, and served at the Battle of the Bulge. And 10 minutes into the Battle of the Bulge, his first lieutenant had his head taken off in front of him. And Lefty talked about what it was like to fight in World War II and to fight the Nazis. And he told me some personal anecdotes, and I was telling him how I was struggling with coming to an end. And what was interesting is the stories that Lefty told me about World War II were oddly familiar to me. I interviewed one veteran from the Korean War. The Korean War veteran story, Lefty's story, and the story I was being told by the men and women that served in Afghanistan and Iraq and in other places were vaguely familiar. Lefty said to me, "Beau, sooner or later, you're just going to have to stop because there'll always be somebody else to write about. Right. And you need to bring this in for a landing, and you'll know when." And he was right. And he did me a great honor. He told me he was going to write the foreword for me. Regrettably, he passed before that could happen. But he'd read some of the narratives. He was very interested in the book, and we kept in touch. And sadly, it was 2 more years before I finally finished, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And to be perfectly candid with you, I've got enough that there was enough material that I had to leave out. I could probably write 2 more books. because you just can't get it all in there. And then some, quite frankly, they just couldn't, they couldn't make it.
Right.
They just couldn't make it public.
It's too tough, right? So,
it was just too hard.
So, I mean, because some of the things that, you read the stories, it's an IED explosion, it's sniper fire, it's, mortar that comes flying in. And this was shocking to me, you talk about, not you, but the veterans, some of the female veterans who were sexually assaulted by members of their own battalion, and that's the trauma that they face to this day. So those are very powerful things to read in this book, but you were able to capture it. And like I said, I'm halfway through. I don't want to put this book down. So it's
well, I did interview multiple women who were sexually assaulted, and that is a real problem. I interviewed probably 7, and they told me their stories in graphic detail, which is very, very, very hard to hear and then to try to write about. And regrettably, I say regrettably, it's not the right word. None of them in the end could agree to being in the book. And the reason was because I was going to show pictures. I was going to, give the unedited version. And they didn't want to be remembered as, okay, that's my service, because that's not true.
Right.
That's not the summation of their service.
Correct.
It's just part of their service. But I felt compelled to mention it in the acknowledgments, because these women are some of the bravest warriors I have ever met.
Yeah.
And make no mistake, they are warriors in the truest sense of the word. And I wanted to write about it. I had to acknowledge it, because I know that there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of other women who have gone through similar situations.
Yep.
Whether it was I had women that stated they were assaulted by people in their own unit. I had one that said they don't know because they were at a joint military base and they didn't see their attacker. And I want to be very sensitive to that.
Sure.
And I'll share with you something that's not in the book. I had a female veteran that I have so much respect for, who had been assaulted, and I felt like I needed to interview them a second time. So I'm at a hotel at a Project Healing Waters event. This was years ago. And I said, hey, Sarah, not her real name.
Sure.
Hey, Sarah, I want to interview. Okay. And we did the event, and she comes to my hotel room, and it was one of these old, Best Westerns, 2-story, the pool is in the center, and, right. And the pool isn't a pool anymore. It's grown over, right? We've all been there. And she comes over. It's about 8 o'clock at night, and I'm propping the door open. And if you know anything about hotel rooms, it's very difficult to prop the door open. And they keep closing. And Sarah said, what in the name of God are you doing? I said, well, Sarah, I'm propping the door open. Yes, Beau, I can see that. Why? I said, well, She said, no, what's the deal? I said, well, Sarah, it's 8 o'clock at night. It's dark. And you're in this hotel room alone with me. And I'll never forget. She said, Beau, I'm perfectly safe because I'm in here with you. And that was probably the most powerful, one of the most powerful moments for me doing this book. Now, I could not relate her story, at least not yet. I'm hopeful that one day I will be able to, but I cannot put into words how honored I felt to be told their stories. Another person I did mention by name in the book who helped me a lot, his name was Paul Norman, combat tour gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps, tough as nails. This guy wouldn't make John Wayne sweat, right? This guy's like 2 T's in tough. And I was explaining to him that I was struggling. I'm having a hard time here. I don't know what I'm doing. And I've never written anything like this. And he looked at me and he said, Beau, just interview them and tell the truth and leave anything political out of it. Because he said, I can tell you, I've been there. And when people are shooting at you and when it's all going to hell, nobody's thinking about the Constitution. Nobody's thinking about the flag. You're thinking about, can I keep my fellow veterans safe? Can I protect my battle buddy? That's all we're thinking of. So I wanted to, you know, I listened to what Lefty Cray told me, and I listened to what Paul Norman told me, and I hope and pray that I've done these men and women justice by conveying their story. Again, I want to stress this is not an easy reading book. This is not a feel-good novel.
Yes.
This is about as raw and authentic as you can get, and I can tell you, it's watered down. When I mean watered down, I mean
from the original stories.
Oh my
you
gosh!
have to cultivate
it
them
just
to,
it is just some of these people. Robert Bartlett, Duke Davis, Marine, David Folkerts, some of these other people that I wrote about, Jessica Callahan. You could write a book about them. But you could practically write an entire book on the veterans. And here's one thing I learned about the veterans. The more they did, the less they're going to talk about it.
Right. They're not in there for self-gratification.
No, most of them were horrified. Their biggest fear was somehow they were going to be lionized. That was their biggest fear. They do not want to be seen as someone. I had to beg these people to be involved, literally beg them. And multiple veterans in the very end said, I can't do it. And I said, but they need to know what you did. And he said, I can't. I can't. And they come back and they're like, well, I'm sure they talk to their wives or their husbands and children and tell them. No, they don't.
Right. And
as I had one Marine say, I'm not going to talk to them about that. That's why I went to war, so they didn't have to experience it. And I want to encourage the average person, just the average American citizen, when you see a veteran, just go up and say, hey, I appreciate the fact that you're serving. And you know, flippantly, oh, thank you for your service. And sometimes they feel uncomfortable. So Beau, I don't, you know, I really don't know what to do. You know what you can do? Just
say thank you.
Say thank you, or pay for a cup of coffee at Starbucks. I remember one time, it really made me feel good. I was at a Chinese restaurant. I was at my favorite restaurant in Warrenton. And I saw a service member come in, and he was in uniform, and he was there with his wife and 3 kids. And I'm about to finish my dinner, and I waved the waitress down, and I said, I want his bill. And this was in the height of the Afghanistan conflict. And she got a big smile on her face, and she said, well, Beau, I'd be happy to give you his bill, but that man over there has already paid for it. Right? So, but being appreciative, and you may not get, you know, the response you want. They might be a little surprised. And if I might be so bold as to say, we need to be doing the same thing with our public servants, especially our police officers, to say thank you. Because while if there's a bad incident with a police officer, it's going to be on the front page. When they do a great job, you almost never hear about it. So I refuse to let a few bad apples, and we have bad apples in the fire department. I hate to spoil anybody's image of everything being great, but people are people, and sometimes they make mistakes and they make the wrong decisions. But we need to thank them for what they've done, because they're not going to come up and tell you. They're not. I had a friend of mine, he said that his father died, that he served in World War II. His father never spoke about it, and this was the editor of a magazine. He said, my dad died, and we cleaned out the attic, and he said, Beau, I found 7 bronze stars.
Never knew.
And he said, my father never spoke to me about it. And when we see our men and women in uniform, just remember, we live in safety not because we're lucky.
Because of them.
Right. I saw a bumper sticker one time. I'm not a big bumper sticker guy, but I saw a bumper sticker one time that had a huge impact on me. I never forgot. It was very simple. The bumper sticker said, sleep well tonight because your U.S. Air Force won't. And I was like, wow. Yeah. It never occurred to me. Somebody's on duty all the time. Mm-hmm. People are patrolling. Those fighter jets are up all the time, and on Christmas and New Year's Eve. And, you know, these men and women are out there. It's their child's 16th birthday or their wife's having a baby. It doesn't matter.
Right.
It doesn't matter. They have a job to do, and they're going to stay there until Uncle Sam says they can come home. So we need to remember that, and we need to appreciate our men and women in peacetime too. Oftentimes, we don't appreciate the water until the well runs dry.
And that's the sad part. That's where we need to
Well, it's human nature, right?
Because
it's just human nature, and this book was just written to help remind people. And like I said, I'm hoping that therapists might take it never occurred to me that a prison might want it, or that psychologists would start buying them by the case. But people are people, and I know for myself as a firefighter and a paramedic, you know, you see some things and you get dinged up a little bit. Mm-hmm. And we need, you know, as quote unquote rescuer types, we want to take action, and we rarely want to spend the time to take care of ourselves. One of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln is, if I had 12 hours to cut down a tree, I'd spend 11 hours sharpening the axe. You know, and the thing is, we're not very good at doing maintenance on ourselves.
No.
For whatever reason, right? We don't do that.
So we deflect the whole time. Yeah. Or as you said, go into isolationism, turn to the bottle of bourbon.
Right.
Something that's very negative.
And as you rightly pointed out, the maintenance here is getting out on the river. Mm-hmm. The maintenance here is having a really tough firefight with a smallmouth bass, right? Yep. The tactics here is, how am I going to move undercover to put this pattern under that limb on that drift to get that rising brown trout, right? So it's a different kind of tactics, but the outcome is the same, and that is to find some peace and serenity in God's creation outside, and to enjoy the river and enjoy the outdoors and just being on the stream together with your buddy.
To live in the new moment versus living in the past.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Beau, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you here. Again, the book is Healing Waters, Veteran Stories in Their Own Words. I want to allow people to get a moment to capture that QR code or go to your website. The QR code will take you to the website as well, where you can order the book, order individual copies, order cases. If you therapy, you actually have me thinking to order a case for my local Project Healing Waters chapter, because there's a number of veterans there that I think would really benefit from this book. I think it's a fantastic book, and I cannot thank you enough today for coming in and spending this time to discuss your work and this book, and thank you for your service as a firefighter for over 30 years too. You saw quite a bit. I know it's different than the military, as you said, but still, you served our local area, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very fortunate to have worked for Fairfax County. It's a great department, and we have men and women right now in Florida and in North Carolina dealing with the recent hurricanes. And I would just like to say, you know, you really don't pay much attention to it, right? You're driving down the road and a fire engine goes by or an ambulance goes by. And I'm telling you right now, for every time you see one in the daytime, there's probably 2 of them out at night. And we appreciate the opportunity to give back to our own communities. And I just want to say for people that wanted the book, they can go to my website, which is my name, beaubeasley.com, or they can order it, from Amazon, or they can perhaps they contact their local Barnes & Noble or library and say, hey, do you have this? You can certainly buy the book for yourself, or I'm hoping that there are people that may consider purchasing the book for themselves so they understand, why is my daughter so different? What happened? My son doesn't talk to me. Well, this might give you some insight. It's not a panacea, and they're not going to get better overnight, but Project Healing Waters and other organizations like that can give them the opportunity to get outside and heal.
Beau, thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me today.
For another episode of Off the Hook with Matty D.